recording. There we go, starting the recording. I'm going to do from beginning. Can you all see this then? You all can see the lecture? The slides, correct?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, you guys can see everything? Okay, sweet. Alright, so for this lecture on medieval history, this is lecture number 3. And continuing on with the castle theme that I have begun going with this, I am doing siege warfare this time. Okay, so first up we have just like an overbroad thing of some of the most common types of siege weaponry used by people attacking castles. So we have the ballista, the battering ram, the catapult, the siege tower, and then the trebuchet. And then that's just kind of like a picture of a siege battle. Moving on. Okay, so then we have the ballista. So the ballista resembled basically like a giant crossbow. And so it would have worked mostly like a crossbow did, where you have the arm obviously with a string that's pulled tense with a system of springs and gears. And it will launch like a massive bolt. So basically like a crossbow bolt, except like probably like 10 times the size at least. So these things were big enough to shear through armor, really anything. Probably go all the way through a horse if it shot it. Like I said, I used tension from like a series of springs to fire it, much like the normal crossbow did. So you would be able to crank it until, you know, you pulled it fully back into place. And then you could just leave it like that until you were ready to fire. The ballista was first designed by the Greeks. The Greeks were one of the first to use a lot of different methods of siege warfare, which was most commonly given to the medieval ages. And then it was a commonly used weapon within the Roman Empire. In a lot of the Roman sieges, they tended to use ballistas a lot. Because the ballista it could be lightweight enough where you could move it fairly easily, but then it also launched a massive bolt that you could use for really going through anything. Not the best for, obviously, like full-on attacking castles because of the stone walls, but you could use it against like the actual defenders, because if that ballista bolt hits you, it's going to kill you, even more likely than, you know, your little crossbow bolt will. And then a lot of the later inventions made the ballista obsolete. So this is like a picture of a ballista. I believe this is a Roman ballista. So as you can see, the bolt would go, and let me turn on my laser pointer. Okay, so obviously the bolt would go right here. You have the string, which you'd crank back using this right here. And the rope would essentially just, you know, wrap itself around there, fires, launches. And then, so that's basically the rough design of the ballista. And like I said, it's lightweight enough where with these wheels and such, you could attach them to oxen or horses and then pull them behind you. So I will go ahead, turn off my laser pointer. There we go. Moving on. So the next up we have the battering ram, and this is the most common thing that we see in most forms of media when it comes to sieges. So the battering ram was used mostly to smash the fortifications of castles. And the most common area that it would be used to attack the fortifications would be the gate, because the gate is typically your weakest point into a castle. It's not always the weakest point, and they were made to withstand a lot, but the gate of a castle is typically going to be your weakest point in the area you're going to want to attack. So it was typically just like and I have bring up a picture there, kind of like that. That's a later design of a battering ram, but it was typically just like a long wooden log with a metal cap. And really simple ones, which would have been used back in the beginnings of siege warfare, it would just be basically a big log that you would have a bunch of people grab onto and you'd run at the gate. Not the safest thing to do, because when you hit that gate with a big log, all that shockwave is gonna send you flying back. And so you had a lot of instances where it might fall down, break people's legs, arms. It was a really dangerous style of siege warfare. But then later ones, like as you can see right here, it would have, obviously, and I'm gonna pull up my laser pointer again, because why not? As you can see, it would have like a canopy over it. And then typically they might be a lot larger so that you could have people inside of the actual canopy to protect them from fires. Like arrows, people dumping boiling oil on you, rocks, things like that. And then you would be able to use your, obviously, manpower to move the long wooden log. But then they were also, especially in the later versions, they would use a lot more of like a spring tension, which gave it a lot more force when hitting that gate. And then the early versions of a battering ram were especially vulnerable to defenders because there was no protection whatsoever. So the people carrying the battering ram were usually the targets of archers, people dumping boiling oil on you. That was a fun medieval defense. Oh. Alright, so moving on then. Okay, so next up we have the catapult. And the catapult is another really common siege weapon that we see most days in most forms of media, and I'll pull up the catapult. And so the catapult was used mostly to launch basically massive stones over walls or at walls, towers, really anything that you wanted to chuck a massive stone at to try to break it. And catapults were used long before the Middle Ages. Most people think that they were really only used during the Middle Ages, but both the Greeks and the Romans used them a lot. And their like Roman ships and Greek ships used to carry catapults on them, and they would use that in their sea battles. And like I said, they're most often used to launch like heavy stones because you would use that to break apart the walls, break apart the towers, and then obviously if you launch it over the wall, it's going to be able to start busting apart buildings within the walls. And then they could also be used to launch incendiary projectiles, so basically flaming rocks. If you were to dump like a bunch of tar over that rock and light it on fire and then launch it, you now have basically a massive fireball. Or another common style that they would use is they would make basically like a giant hay bale, light that on fire, and then launch it over the wall as well. And that was used to basically just cause chaos and fires within the castle wall to try to basically break down the defenders. And then the onager and mangonial are considered variations of the catapults. They're really just the onager, I believe, was mostly situated in Europe, and then the mangonial was mostly in Italy, I believe, was their style. And then on, obviously, as you can see here on the picture that I have of the catapult, you have a restraining rope, which you'd use to pull back the arm, which would have the payload or stone inside this bucket. And basically you would just like cut that rope, and with the tension of that arm, it just launches the stone or whatever projectile you're using at whatever you're aiming at. And then I have to turn off my laser pointer so I can move on. There we go. Okay, so next one we have is the siege tower. And the siege tower was basically just a big wooden tower put on wheels. And it was massive structures. They normally were made so that they would be over the top of these walls. And you have to remember, castle walls, especially in medieval times, could get up to like 30-40 feet tall. So what would that be? I think like 4 or 5 stories almost. And they took a long time to build these things. Like, this was no easy task. And so you normally only built your siege towers if all your other forms of siege weaponry failed, whether that's scaling ladders, battering ram, breaking apart the walls with catapults. If none of that works, you move on to the siege tower. And they were normally constructed at like the site of the siege, so you didn't make these before the siege, you made them at the siege spot, because they were incredibly difficult to move. It would take dozens upon dozens of men to push these, or horses, oxen, whatever you used for the power to push these massive towers. And so before the Middle Ages, they were most commonly used by the Romans, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Assyrians and Babylonians, obviously, long before the Romans. The Romans would have borrowed them from, or the idea for them from the Assyrians and Babylonians. And they just basically provided protection for the attackers, because while you're up in that tower, archers aren't going to be able to get at you. You're basically safe now from all defenders' attacks. far. So it's a very effective way at the very end of a siege. Okay, and then next up we have the trebuchet. And the trebuchet, as you can see here in this picture, is basically a massive catapult. Like a super sized catapult, a catapult in steroids if you want to go there. And it basically had this long swinging arm, which you would then have, let me get my laser pointer back up. So yep, you had the long arm, and then attached to that you would have the bucket with the payload in it, typically just big heavy stones again. And you had mostly two different styles of trebuchets. You had the counterweight trebuchet, which is the ones that are most commonly seen, and that's basically the trebuchet where you would have basically a big rock or brick of sorts, and then that would be your counterweight for your payload. And then traction trebuchets, they used more of just pure manpower for them. And so the traction trebuchet was kind of the first design that was used mostly from the 5th to 10th centuries of the Middle Ages. So from about 400 to 900 roughly, I believe. And then the counterweight was used mostly from the 10th to 15th centuries of the Middle Ages. And then, like all other forms of siege weaponry, gunpowder eventually made it obsolete as well, because now you've got cannons, you've got gunsmen, they're basically completely obsolete. Alright. And then lastly but not least, we have basically the defense methods, and that's just kind of an image of another siege. And so the defenders had like a lot of different options, because basically you have an army now within these walls, so you'd have all your different strategies, whatever you're going to use. But some of the typical methods that they would employ would be dropping rocks on top of defenders attackers coming up scaling ladders, dropping boiling oil on them. That was always, like I said, a very fun way to die, is having boiling oil dumped on top of your head. And then the defenders also used catapults, and it was just as effective for the defenders to use catapults as the attackers, because the attackers typically are not going to have a whole lot of protection from things like catapults. You could also use it against, say, siege towers to bust those apart. So it's quite an effective way. And castles also typically had like also ballistas, which they would use then to fire down upon attackers. And that's obviously going to be a pretty deadly weapon for the defenders. And then a lot of the archers, especially in later day Middle Ages, would use crossbows. And of course you've got your archers atop the walls, you've got the archers within the wall, which is where you'd have like those arrow slits and like towers and such that you see in most forms of media. Then of course you just got your basic strong fortifications. You got this massive stone wall protecting you, you've got a heavy, normally oaken gate, which would have like metal plates and such woven through it to help increase the strength of it. And then, as we most often see, you have the moat around the castle as well. And that employs another form of defense for these castles. And so I believe that is all I have for you guys tonight. Once again, thanks for coming, like always. It was a fun time, and I definitely enjoy having you guys listen to me ramble about all